I would like to start first of thanking you for this invitation of this beautiful event. And I would like to give a bit an insight today on possible renewable energy options that could help us reaching the decarbonization targets ahead, and give also a bit an insight in short to mid-term challenges that we need to address urgently if we want to go that way in deploying these technologies. Urgently because we are really running out of time, as we will see what is needed to deploy these technologies until 2050. Yeah. So the context within Europe, but also more globally, is that within Europe, we are aiming within the framework of the European Green Deal for climate neutrality until 2050. And basically that means that we will need a lot of renewable energy until 2050. We see here some figures and estimates for the European member state countries, where we estimated about 85% of the electricity generated will be coming from renewable sources. And the oceans, and in particularly ocean technologies, take here a pivotal role. We see here also on the left corner that until 2030, the European offshore renewable energy strategy estimates in its modeling about 60 gigawatt of wind energy, 1 gigawatt of ocean energy, and this will further accelerate until 2050 towards 300 gigawatt, 40 gigawatt of ocean technology. And there, of course, we have to think then of other uses of the sea: tourism, fisheries, transport, defense, and what we heard already today in many presentations on the impact on the environment, and that our biodiversity targets are still compatible with the deployment of these technologies. So a coordinated spatial planning approach is needed. Oh, work. So where are we today with these technologies? We have a set of technologies that are at the early stage to market uptake. So from the left to the right, we see different types of technologies, and at the bottom, the scale of deployment that is happening right now in Europe and globally. And as you can see here, technologies like wave energy, tidal energy, floating photovoltaics in the oceans are at a very early stage. They need additional R&D supported by different programs nationally or even from the European Commission. And we have, especially in the wind sector, technologies with floating wind, offshore, a wind that is fixed to the seabed, which is already at the market uptake or commercial scale. And most of my presentation will focus on these two technologies, as they will be really the pillar within the oceans, as it's planned in the strategy towards the decarbonization targets. But what we can say for almost all of this, or all of these technologies, continuous research and innovations are needed from the public sector, but also from the private sector. We see now what's the situation right now. On the left-hand side, I'm sorry, it's a bit small, most probably. We see the deployment rates in European member state countries that are right now at a scale of 16 gigawatts, which show the remarkable growth in the last decade. We had a lot of technology progress and cost reductions that enabled this pathway. And we see that, for example, the size of the wind turbines increased since 2010 by 140%, 44%, and we have now offshore wind turbines of huge scale, comparable, for example, with the Eiffel Tower, at capacities of one single turbine in the range of 15 megawatts. And they are now capable to meet 2% of the electricity demand of Europe. So we are speaking here already of an established technology when it comes to bottom-fixed offshore wind technology. On a global scale, specifically, China has shown remarkable growth in the last 2 years. That came because there was a shift in the subsidy regime of this country from very generous feed-in tariffs to more competitive tender-based support schemes. And there, of course, there was a rush to deploy as much as possible in the last 2 years. Still, we see then on the very right side that there's a huge gap towards the formulated targets, and if there are no targets, then the estimates that we see in different countries of the world. In the upper section, we see Asia-Pacific countries with China, for example, as one big player in the future targets until 2030. But also India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam are expressing a big interest in this technology and formulated targets. On the other hand, we see Europe is still leading in 2030 if these targets are reached, and also in the American countries, US and Brazil, in the midterm, there will be deployments of significant scale. I think I missed out one slide, maybe, or the pointer is not working. Can we move back, maybe? One more? No, there should be one slide on technical potentials, a map. No. Yeah, this one, exactly. So maybe that's also interesting to see what is the potential of offshore technologies. Here, the example of Europe, we made an analysis of the member state countries and the areas that are easily available to deploy the technology. We see that there are vast technical potentials for offshore wind in the European member states and also in the UK and neighboring countries of a scale of about 5 terawatt of capacity. Just to compare, the current power plant park of Europe is about 1 terawatt, so almost 5 times the capacity can be deployed based on this analysis. And we have only used really a tiny fraction of it, and we can increase this potential even more if we invest in floating offshore wind and help emerging countries towards offshore wind to tap into this technology. So we see, for example, in the European context that countries that are not first players like the North Sea neighboring countries, that they are now with new technologies aiming for these areas. And we can see here on the map that in the North Sea, you see maybe here some brown and orange spots. These are areas with a very shallow seabed. So we are speaking here of areas between 30 and 60 meter depth. And then the bluish regions close to, for example, Portugal or the Bay of Biscay, there we have dark blue spots. These would be areas that could host floating offshore wind, where we have depths of from 100 to 1,000 meter sea depth. So floating offshore wind would be an enabler for new countries to go into offshore wind. and also an enabler for countries worldwide that have steeper coastlines. So maybe it works now. Yeah. These ambitious offshore and onshore wind targets are challenging. They are putting pressure on global supply chains. And I mapped out here the shares where the wind energy supply chain is located right now. So the reddish bars are the Chinese market shares as compared to light blue, the European ones. And so we have here already a worldwide supply chain, and we need to see, as for example on the right-hand side, how we can address on the short-term potential bottlenecks that might come up. The green bars show current deployment rates of offshore wind, and we see that in 2030, the bigger bar on the left, or the bigger range on the left, on the right-hand side. This is the expected deployment rate that is needed in the European context to reach the 2030 targets. And that's just the first step before more accelerated deployment will be needed towards our decarbonization targets. So we need to invest and cooperate among countries and competitors. And we need to avoid trade barriers such as local content requirements to address these bottlenecks. Because here on the right-hand side, the blue bars, we see that we are running into these bottlenecks in very important components like blades or generators, and everything that hinders trade and technology diffusion through trade should be avoided. Another challenge is through this accelerated deployment is that we are in the need of critical materials. If you would cut through the cross-section of a wind turbine blade, you find a lot of composite materials, but also a material which is very specific, namely balsa wood as a structural component in the wind turbine blades. And this is basically sourced from one single country, which is Ecuador. So if we see that this accelerated deployment all over the world, in Europe, in US, now in China, with this shift in the support scheme is happening, we are causing also a hard demand on very few countries, like, for example, Ecuador, which is not only beneficial for the supply chain, but also not beneficial for the country itself, as this, for example, can cause not only supply bottlenecks for the material, but also overlogging in the country of the wood and soaring prices, as we see here in the bottom part of the graph, where we see that the trade value for balsa wood exports really skyrocketed in 2020. To some extent, now manufacturers of blades are replacing this material with recycled PET, and there we come in the circularity topic, or with new innovations like hybrid designs. And this offers then also a cost-competitive alternative to, but also a more sustainable sustainable solution to these manufacturers. Just to explain also the upper graph here, we are trying to map all materials that are needed for the technologies, and balsa wood was in this case one where our supply risk indicator indicated that there might be a challenge in the coming years. Another important material, and we heard a lot today also about sourcing materials, and are rare earth materials. Again, we see the supply risk of different rare earth elements on the left-hand side. And then these rare earth materials are used in permanent magnets in the generators of the wind turbines. And this is because with the size of these wind generators that increases over the last decade, also the need for a higher power density, reduced size, and reduced weight came into play. And permanent magnets replace conventional rotor windings in the generators of offshore wind turbines. And we see in the middle graph, indicated as yellow and red bars, the share of generators that use now permanent magnets instead of conventional drivetrains. And as you can see, in the last 4 or 5 years in the European context, this technology basically replaced all other drivetrains. Similar developments we see on a regional, on an international level, in global regions in 2020, where wind turbines, offshore wind turbines using permanent magnets have an increasing share. The upper bar indicates the Chinese share, followed by the world and Europe. And again here, RNI can help to substitute or recycle, reuse critical materials like permanent magnets, and also new innovations like from General Electric or Greenspore, as I point out here, 2 examples are investigating new materials, superconducting technology, or ferrite-based generators. So again here, RNI is a key to address this challenge. Another factor which is very important in the future and also in the present is maritime spatial planning for the coexistence of renewables with other sectors. I showed here just as an example the maritime spatial plan of Belgium. Why Belgium? Because it's a very limited area, very small sea that is under the or is part of the Belgium Sea, and we have here a lot of interactions with different sectors. We have renewable energy marked here as red zones for offshore wind development. We have a lot of corridors that need to be need to address shipping rights, and of course nature conservation zones. So we see there that space is limited. Still, Belgium managed within an integrative process to cope with all these different demands, and showed us also that more coordination is needed to address all aspects in the development of new technologies. And one very specific example for the use of the oceans is also the defense sector. This can be also one sector that can hinder development a lot at the licensing stage. We see here that coordination with the different players in the defense sector is key, and that maritime spatial planning can be here really a solution to identify the potential interactions among the sectors and coordinate also information that is maybe classified or secret, still coming to a solution before it's too late and before conflicts come up at the licensing stage of offshore wind farms. And this is further supported through the European Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which required European member states to establish maritime spatial plans. So this could be also a best practice of emerging countries to have this in mind when going for renewable energy. Maybe here's one of the last slides. I mentioned this throughout my presentation, and boosting research and innovation is a very important precondition for large-scale deployment of offshore renewable energy. We see here a graph of the European support through major R&I programs on wind energy related topics. The yellow bars and the yellow bars with the pattern show the support given to projects that address floating offshore wind or offshore wind technology. And we see that within the last 15 and 20 years, together with R&I support from the member states themselves, it was possible to address really specific problems in the offshore wind sector to come from this early R&D stage towards commercialization of these technologies. And as I said in the beginning, for a technology like floating, but also for wave or tidal energy, this continuous support is needed to come to that stage that we can also use this technology on a very short term, addressing the decarbonization targets worldwide. The big challenges in R&I include aerodynamics, structural dynamics, the hydrodynamics of enlarged wind turbines, but also grid integration and fundamental flow physics. So these are the challenges that are ahead of us if we look into the next years. I think I'm already over the time, is that right? Oh, I'm sorry. Just very quickly to sum up some key messages. Technology development and innovations, of course, are needed. We need a common effort from the public and private sectors to address a stable regulatory framework and also to have steady investments into supply chain and to avoid bottlenecks. Any abrupt change in policy support schemes or retroactive measures are causing bottlenecks and will hinder us to reach these targets. So emerging markets should ensure that support schemes ensure a steady deployment and that cost reduction is achieved for these technologies in emerging markets. They could build on already experience made in the established offshore wind markets like Denmark and Germany, where they went to a kind of one-stop shop model to speed up, for example, the permitting process, where the government agencies are responsible and not the developers. And as a very last slide now, I think one very important part when it comes to resources is to decouple economic growth from resource use through circular economy strategies. And for offshore, that really means covering the entire offshore wind supply chain, from the use of alternative materials for blades to novel strategies in operation and maintenance. Maritime special planning is key, as we have seen it, for the coexistence of this new technology with other users of the sea. And we need continuous support in public and private R&I as a precondition for the large scale-up of these technologies, which will even more increase through investments in the transmission grid and in the hydrogen production that is envisioned to happen in different markets. I'm very sorry for being a bit too long, and I'm very curious if there are any questions.
Thank you, Thomas. We are running a little late, but maybe we can take one question from the floor. Okay, go ahead, Martin.
Thomas, thank you very much for this really detailed assessment of where we are in the area of wind energy. I actually have a question that sort of connects what you've been saying to the broader discussion here, conversation. I've been hearing numbers. So in the broader conversation is when we talk about, for example, reform, the fisheries reform in Europe as an example, but it's true in other countries as well, some of the imperatives from the ecological point of view, let's say, to reduce fishing, run against the interests of countries of employment, meaning their workforce in the ocean, many of them have to do with fisheries. Also Europe, a lot of fisheries in the marine sector. I've been hearing numbers, and I just want you to reflect on it or maybe confirm that as of 2 years ago, the number of employees in that sector superseded the number of employees in the fishing sector in Europe. If that is true, that should change the power play of unions and alike in support of maybe more sustainable fisheries, i.e. reducing the number of fisheries in Europe and advancing these areas of new jobs and opportunities in the blue economy. Is that true, Thomas?
To be honest, I don't have the exact numbers now for the fisheries sector, but I can confirm that the offshore wind sector sees also in employment this remarkable growth, especially in the development of zones in ports, in the manufacturing sector. So I think it is, I wouldn't be surprised if this statement is correct, but I'm also happy to check that afterwards and convey this message maybe then also in the declaration that is planned.
Thank you, and I think we have about 20 minutes now for a general discussion. Is there someone who wants to start this general discussion, please? Please.
Yeah, so Martin, your point about fisheries jobs versus other jobs, right? It's an important point, but one thing to note is that the same people, it's not the same people who will be in the new job. You'll be leaving some fishes behind. There are social and other consequences, right? So this is where the distributional aspects come into play, you know. Yeah. In Atlantic Canada, we saw one called collapse. The invertebrates came up and people were fishing them, so they were making more money, but the fishes of yesterday couldn't be in the lobster fishery, right? And then you have all these social and economic issues to take care of.
If I can make a comment about the fisheries collapse that you were talking about, I think it's a collapse that never recovered. And this is an example for everyone that it's not just necessary to close down the fisheries for these fish to be able to come back to their normal stocks.
We hear a lot, like, you can't just stop fishing and the fish will come back. And there is some truth to that, especially depending on the extent to which our destruction has gone, right? If you haven't destroyed the habitat and destroyed the basis of the fishery, nature is very forgiving. They usually come back. So that's the issue with the cod stock. It's taking down the habitat, taking down, and when you create that space, other creatures come in. Sometimes you don't like what comes in, right? That's the thing. Hong Kong Airport, if you have flown to Hong Kong, it's actually land reclaimed from the ocean. So you can stop fishing for forever. The fish will not come back. There's no habitat for them, so, yeah.
Thank you. I'm really curious about whether the wind as the resource that we're exploiting, has there been a study about the spatial overlap of wind with other uses of the ocean? In other words, are the places where the wind is the strongest, are those places where fish or productivity is also the highest? Or is there some relationship that creates either conflict or harmony with the offshore wind industry?
Also, one point I wanted to raise with the map that I was showing, we put a lot of very restrictive exclusion criteria on that map, avoiding interference with different sectors, also with fish or with shipping lanes or other sectors or Natura 2000 areas. So I think I will also have to check if there was a restriction on fisheries I doubt it for this assessment. And I'm also not aware if this has been done before in that way, because I think it's a bit difficult to locate where fishery is actually happening areas, if I'm correct. So that might be, it might be difficult to assess, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, there has been an European project called COCONET that I coordinated, in which the plans were to design networks of marine protected areas and offshore wind farm potential in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Because the European Commission wanted just to answer the question, what is the overlap between certain things and others? So if we want to do effective maritime spatial planning, we need to know how the ecosystems functions, what are the boundaries of ecosystems. We introduced the concept of cells of ecosystem functioning as natural units of management and conservation. So we cannot have the maritime spatial planning for the offshore wind farms, another one for other things and so on. There has to be an holistic approach to the use of the sea that requires proper knowledge. And the European Union is pushing for that. But sometimes some DG does something and other DGs do something else. And sometimes they do not speak to each other. But the documents are there, they have been deposited and so on. There has been a tender called COENET with the DG Environment related just to these things. So the outcomes are in the premises of the European Commission if they want to use them.
Okay, thank you. And Jacques?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I'm curious about ecosystems assessments of alternative energy uses, the wind parks, the waves, the tidals, and so on. Not only what are the numbers, but how are ecosystems services and environmental impact studies actually done, and who is listened to in these assessments? We are familiar how communities, NGOs, etc., are engaged with onshore wind parks, but so who is involved? Fisher, who is representing the animals, and so on.
Correctly said. I think in the creation of for example, the offshore renewable energy strategies, all DGs within the Commission are in and bring in their knowledge. Of course, fisheries are, for example, also covered by Directorate MARE, for example, for maritime affairs. Of course, there, the fisheries communities bring in also their knowledge in then the creation of what we saw in the offshore renewable energy strategy, how environmental aspects should be addressed. And I think the set of stakeholders is really covering all fundamental stakeholders within the boundaries of Europe in this case. So we, to my knowledge, this goes, or the fisheries and all other stakeholders are heard when these strategies are implemented. But yeah, I would put it that way.